My name is Sharon Thompson, and I'm 56 years old. I'm sitting here in my small apartment, looking out at the garden where my neighbor Martha tends to her roses. 6 months ago, I never thought I'd be living here, and I certainly never imagined that my own son would try to kill me. There were signs I should have noticed, red flags I ignored because he was my child. But what David didn't know was that someone else was watching everything unfold in silence, someone who saved my life when my own flesh and blood left me to die. Before I share what happened that day, please let me know where you're watching from. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. You won't believe who was secretly watching when my own son left me to die. Let me tell you about my life before everything changed. I'm a widow of 3 years now. My husband Robert passed away from cancer, and after 32 years of marriage, I found myself alone in our two-story house in suburban Ohio. I had been an elementary school teacher for 28 years before I retired, and I thought I was settling into a peaceful life of gardening, reading, and volunteering at the local library. Our house was my pride and joy. Robert and I had bought it when David was just 5 years old. It had this beautiful wraparound porch, a large kitchen with windows overlooking the backyard, and upstairs were 3 bedrooms. After Robert died, I converted his office into a cozy reading nook, but I kept David's childhood bedroom exactly as it was, hoping he'd visit more often. My son David is 32 years old now. He had been married to Jessica for 8 years, and I thought they were happy. They lived about 2 hours away in Columbus, where David worked for a tech company doing something with computer systems. I never really understood his job, but he seemed successful. They had a nice apartment, took vacations, and Jessica would send me photos of their weekend adventures. Then everything fell apart for him. In January, Jessica filed for divorce. David called me crying, saying she had found someone else and wanted him out of their apartment. 2 weeks later, he lost his job. The company was downsizing, and his position was eliminated. When he called to tell me, I could hear the desperation in his voice. That's when he asked if he could come home for a while, just until he got back on his feet. How could I say no? This was my child, my only child, and he needed his mother. I immediately said yes and started preparing his old room. What I didn't know then was that David had been hiding much more than just his divorce and job loss. He had accumulated massive debt, owed money to people who don't take kindly to late payments, and his desperation had turned into something much darker. My neighbor Martha Williams lives in the house next door. She's 73 years old, a widow like me, and we'd been friends since Robert and I moved in 27 years ago. Martha has this habit of sitting by her kitchen window every morning with her coffee, and from there, she has a perfect view of my house, especially the windows to my first floor bedroom. Martha is one of those people who notices everything. She knows when the mailman is running late, when someone new visits the neighborhood, and she always seemed to sense when something wasn't quite right. After Robert died, she made sure to check on me every few days, bringing homemade soup or just stopping by for tea. When David moved back in, Martha mentioned that she was happy I wouldn't be alone anymore. But even from the beginning, I could tell she was observing him carefully. Martha had raised 4 children of her own, and she had that maternal instinct that could spot trouble from a mile away. The house layout became important later. My bedroom is on the first floor right off the living room. Robert and I had moved down there after his cancer diagnosis because the stairs became difficult for him. David took his old room upstairs, which had its own bathroom, and gave him privacy. What I didn't realize was that this separation would become a crucial factor in what was about to happen. David seemed different from the moment he arrived. The boy I raised had always been cheerful even as an adult. But this David was sullen, angry, and spent most of his time locked in his room. I attributed it to the stress of his divorce and unemployment. I thought if I just gave him love and support, he'd bounce back like he always had. 3 weeks after David moved in, I started noticing things that made me uncomfortable, though I tried to dismiss them at first. My son had always been curious about finances, But now his questions felt different, more urgent and invasive. One evening, while I was making dinner, David sat at the kitchen table and asked, "Mom, do you have a will?" The question caught me off guard. When I asked why he wanted to know, he said he was just making sure I had my affairs in order, especially living alone. It seemed like a reasonable concern from a caring son. So I told him yes, I did have a will and that he was my sole beneficiary. Then he started asking about my life insurance policy. How much was it worth? When had I last updated it? Did I have any other investments? I explained that I had a modest policy worth about $150,000 plus the house which was paid off and a small retirement savings account. David seemed very interested in these details, taking mental notes of everything I said. The following week, I woke up around 2 in the morning to use the bathroom and noticed a light on in the living room. When I investigated, I found David going through my filing cabinet, looking through my important papers. He had my insurance documents, bank statements, and investment records spread across the coffee table. When he saw me, he quickly tried to gather everything up. "Sorry, Mom," he said. "I couldn't sleep and was just trying to help you get organized. Some of these papers are really old." But I knew my filing system. I'm a former teacher and I keep everything meticulously organized. There was no need for him to be going through my private financial information at 2 in the morning. I started paying more attention after that. David claimed to be going to job interviews, but when I offered to drive him or asked how they went, his stories didn't add up. He'd say he had an interview at 10, but I'd see him in his room playing video games at that exact time. When I'd ask about it later, he'd get defensive and say the interview had been rescheduled. The most disturbing discovery came when I overheard a phone conversation he was having in the backyard. He thought I was napping, but I was in my bedroom with the window cracked open. I heard him say, "The old lady won't suspect anything. She trusts me completely." Then he said something about a big payout and making it look natural. When he came back inside, I asked casually who he'd been talking to. He claimed it was a potential employer discussing a job opportunity, but the tone of that conversation haunted me. It didn't sound like any job interview preparation I'd ever heard. Martha noticed changes too. She mentioned that David had strange visitors, people who didn't look like the kind of friends he'd normally have. She'd seen them through her window, men in expensive cars, who'd park in my driveway for short visits. When I asked David about them, he said they were old college friends helping him network for jobs. But the most chilling moment came on a Sunday evening. I was in my bedroom reading when I heard David on the phone again. This time his voice carried clearly through the thin walls. He said, "She won't be a problem much longer. Once this is over, I'll have enough to pay everyone back and start fresh." I lay there in bed, my heart pounding, trying to convince myself that I was misunderstanding. This was my son, the boy I'd raised, who used to bring me flowers from the neighbor's garden when he was 5. But deep in my gut, I knew something was terribly wrong. That night, I decided I would confront David in the morning. I would ask him directly about the phone calls, the late-night snooping, and demand to know what kind of trouble he was in. I thought maybe, if I showed him I was willing to help, whatever darkness had taken hold of him could be lifted. I had no idea that morning would be the last normal conversation we'd ever have. Monday morning, March 15th, started like any other day, except I woke up feeling slightly off. There was a tightness in my chest, nothing severe, just a mild discomfort that I attributed to the stress of worrying about David. I'd been sleeping poorly for weeks, and I figured my body was finally showing the effects. I made coffee and toast, and surprisingly, David came downstairs earlier than usual. He seemed different that morning, almost cheerful. He asked how I'd slept, commented on how nice the weather was, and even offered to make me fresh coffee. For a moment, I felt relieved. Maybe I'd been overthinking everything. I thought I might work in the garden today, I told him, sipping the coffee he'd prepared. It tasted slightly bitter, but I didn't think much of it. The tulips are starting to come up and the flower beds need attention. David smiled and said, "You should take it easy today, Mom. You've been working so hard lately. Why don't you just relax and maybe take a nap this afternoon?" His concern seemed genuine, and I felt guilty for having suspicious thoughts about him. Around 9:30, I started feeling more unwell. The chest discomfort had increased, and I was beginning to feel short of breath. I tried to ignore it, thinking it might be anxiety, but by 10 o'clock I knew something was seriously wrong. The tightness in my chest had become a pressing sensation, like someone was sitting on my ribcage. I called for David, who was upstairs in his room. When he came down, I explained that I wasn't feeling well and thought maybe I should see a doctor. "My chest feels tight," I told him, "and I'm having trouble catching my breath. Could you drive me to the urgent care clinic?" The change in David's demeanor was immediate and chilling. The concerned son from an hour earlier vanished, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. His face became cold, almost calculating. "Mom, you're probably just having anxiety," he said dismissively. "You've been stressed about me being here. You just need to rest." But I knew this wasn't anxiety. I'd never experienced anything like this before. The pain was radiating down my left arm now, and I was beginning to feel nauseous. "David, I think this might be serious," I insisted. "Please, I need to go to the hospital." "No," he said firmly. "You're overreacting. Just go lie down for a while and see how you feel later." He actually stepped between me and the hallway that led to where I kept my purse and car keys. That's when real fear set in, not just about my health, but about my son's behavior. "David, I need my phone," I said, trying to stay calm. "I want to call Dr. Peterson's office and ask what I should do." "You don't need to bother the doctor," David replied, and I watched in disbelief as he picked up my cell phone from the kitchen counter and slipped it into his pocket. "I'll monitor your condition and decide if we need to call anyone." The casual way he took my phone, the authoritative tone about monitoring my condition, made it clear that something had been planned. This wasn't a son concerned about an overprotective mother. This was something else entirely. I tried to stand up to go get the landline phone in my bedroom, but the room started spinning. The chest pain was intensifying, and I was becoming increasingly short of breath. David watched me struggle, making no move to help. In fact, when I started toward my bedroom, he followed me. "I think you should rest in your room," he said, but it wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. And for the first time in my life, I was afraid of my own child. What happened next still feels like a nightmare I can't wake up from. David helped me to my bedroom, but not out of kindness. As soon as I sat on the edge of my bed trying to catch my breath, he stepped back toward the door. I was hunched over the pain in my chest, now radiating down both arms, and I could feel my heart racing irregularly. "David, please," I gasped. "Something is really wrong. I need help." But he just stood there, watching me with an expression I'd never seen before. It was cold, detached, like he was observing an experiment. When I tried to get up to go to my bedside table, where I kept a backup phone, David quickly moved to block my path. "Stay on the bed, Mom," he said firmly. "You need to rest." That's when I saw him reach into his pocket and pull out not just my cell phone, but also the cordless phone from my nightstand. He must have taken it while I was struggling to breathe. "David, what are you doing?" I asked, though part of me already knew. Without saying a word, he stepped out of my bedroom, and I heard the most terrifying sound of my life, the click of the lock engaging. David had locked me in my own bedroom. The old house had skeleton key locks on most doors, a feature Robert and I had thought was charming. Now it was my prison. I rushed to the door as fast as my weakened state would allow and turned the handle. Nothing. I was trapped. "David," I called out, pounding on the door. "David, open this door right now." I could hear him moving around the house, and then I heard his voice. But he wasn't talking to me. He was on the phone with someone. "Everything is going according to plan," I heard him say. "It should be over soon." "Yeah, she's starting to show symptoms." The full horror of my situation hit me then. My son wasn't just refusing to help me during a medical emergency. He had planned this, The questions about my insurance, the late night, searching through my papers, the strange phone conversations, everything fell into place. David was waiting for me to die. I tried the window, but it was an old casement window that had been painted over years ago and hadn't been opened in decades. Even if I could get it open, I was too weak now to climb out. The pain in my chest was becoming unbearable, and I recognized the symptoms from when my husband had his first heart attack. I was having a heart attack, and my son was intentionally preventing me from getting help. I pounded on the door until my fists were bruised, calling his name, begging him to let me out. But David had gone upstairs, and I could hear him playing music loudly, drowning out my cries. The realization that he was deliberately covering the sound of my distress was almost worse than the physical pain. As the minutes ticked by, my condition worsened. The chest pain became a crushing sensation, and I was struggling to stay conscious. I found a piece of paper and a pen in my nightstand and wrote a shaky note. David locked me in. Having heart attack. Need help. I managed to slide it under the door, hoping against hope that if someone found my body, they'd know this wasn't natural. I also tried sliding the note through the tiny gap at the bottom of my window, praying that maybe someone would see it. But by now I was becoming lightheaded and had to lie down. I could feel my heart beating erratically, and I knew I was running out of time. The most heartbreaking part was calling out for my son, the child I'd raised and loved unconditionally, and knowing that he was deliberately ignoring my pleas for help. I kept thinking there had to be some mistake, that this couldn't really be happening. But as the pain intensified and my breathing became more labored, I had to face the truth. My own son was trying to kill me for my insurance money. What I didn't know was that Martha Williams was having her usual morning coffee by her kitchen window. At 73 years old, Martha had developed routines that kept her connected to the world around her, and watching the neighborhood from her window was one of them. She wasn't being nosy, she was being cautious. Living alone as an older woman, she'd learned to be aware of her surroundings. Martha had noticed that I hadn't come out to tend my garden as I did every morning. She knew my schedule because we'd been neighbors for so long, and she could usually see me puttering around my flower beds by 10 o'clock. When 11 came and went without any sign of me, she started to feel concerned. She'd also observed David's behavior over the past few weeks. Martha had raised 4 children and had developed a sixth sense about trouble. Something about David's demeanor, the way he carried himself, and especially the type of visitors he'd been having, made her uneasy. She'd mentioned to her daughter during their weekly phone call that she was worried about me living with David. Around 11:15, Martha heard something that made her put down her coffee cup and pay closer attention. It was faint, but she was sure she heard someone calling for help. The sound seemed to be coming from my house, specifically from the area where my bedroom window faced her kitchen. Martha got her binoculars, the ones she used for bird watching, and focused them on my house. What she saw made her blood run cold. Through my bedroom window, she could see me pressing against the glass, my mouth open, as if I was shouting, my face pale and distressed. I appeared to be trying to open the window, but I looked weak and unsteady. Martha immediately knew something was terribly wrong. She'd never seen me in distress like this, and the fact that I was clearly trying to get out of my own bedroom suggested I was trapped. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911. "This is Martha Williams on Elm Street," she told the dispatcher. "I need an ambulance and police at 1526 Elm Street immediately. My neighbor appears to be trapped in her bedroom and is in medical distress." The dispatcher asked for more details, and Martha explained what she was observing. "She's at her window, trying to get out, and she looks like she's in pain. Something is very wrong over there." While she was on the phone with 911, Martha saw David come out onto the front porch. He looked around casually, almost checking to see if anyone was watching. When the ambulance and police cars arrived, about 8 minutes later, David walked out to meet them with what Martha later described fake concern. She watched as David spoke to the paramedics and police officers, gesturing and explaining something. From her window, Martha could see him pointing toward the house and shaking his head as if dismissing their concerns. The emergency responders seemed to be buying whatever story he was telling them. That's when Martha knew she had to act. She ran outside, still in her house slippers, and approached the group. "Officers," she called out. "That woman is trapped in her bedroom. I saw her at the window calling for help." David turned to look at Martha with an expression of annoyance mixed with panic. "Mrs. Williams," he said, "my mother is just having a bad day. She gets confused sometimes and thinks she's locked in when she's not. The door isn't even locked." But Martha wasn't backing down. "I've known Sharon Thompson for 27 years, she told the police firmly. "She is not confused, and she was clearly in distress. You need to check on her immediately." The lead police officer looked between David and Martha, then made the decision that saved my life. "Sir, we're going to need to see your mother and make sure she's okay." David had no choice but to lead them into the house. Martha followed, her heart pounding, praying that she wasn't too late. When the paramedics and police officers entered my house, David continued his performance. "She's been really stressed lately," he explained as he led them toward my bedroom. "Sometimes she gets anxious and thinks she's trapped when she's not. The door isn't even locked." But when David reached for the door handle to my bedroom, something interesting happened. The officer closest to him noticed David fumble with something in his pocket first. It was the skeleton key he'd used to lock me in. In that moment, the officer realized that Martha had been right. As the door opened, they found me semi-conscious on my bed, my face gray, and my breathing labored. The lead paramedic immediately recognized the signs of a heart attack and began emergency treatment right there in my bedroom. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" the paramedic asked as he checked my pulse. My heart rate was dangerously irregular, and my blood pressure was critically low. "We need to get her to the hospital immediately," he told his partner. As they prepared to move me, one of the police officers found the note I had managed to slip under my door. "David locked me in. Having heart attack. Need help." The officer showed it to his partner, and they both looked at David with new suspicion. "Sir, can you explain this note?" the officer asked David. David's story began to fall apart. She must have written that when she was confused," he stammered. "Sometimes when people are having medical episodes, they get paranoid." But Martha, who had followed them inside, spoke up again. "Officer, I watched this woman at her window for over an hour. She was clearly trying to get out and calling for help. She wasn't confused. She was trapped." The paramedics were working quickly to stabilize me for transport. "Her condition is critical," one of them reported. "If we'd arrived much later, this could have been fatal." While the medical team focused on saving my life, the police officers began to piece together what had really happened. They asked David why he hadn't called for help if his mother was having a heart attack. His explanation that he thought I was just anxious didn't align with the severity of my condition. Then one officer made a crucial discovery. David had been carrying my cell phone in his pocket, along with the cordless phone from my bedroom. "Why do you have your mother's phones?" the officer asked. David's face went pale. She gave them to me because she was feeling confused," he said weakly. But the physical evidence told a different story. The skeleton key in David's pocket, my desperate note, Martha's eyewitness account, and the fact that he had deliberately taken my means of communication all pointed to something much more sinister than a medical emergency. As the paramedics loaded me into the ambulance, I was barely conscious, but I could hear Martha's voice. "You're going to be okay, Sharon," she said, squeezing my hand. "I saw everything. You're safe now." At the hospital, the emergency room doctor confirmed that I had suffered a severe heart attack. "If you'd arrived 20 minutes later," Dr. Kim told the police officer who accompanied me, "she likely wouldn't have survived." While I was in surgery having a stent placed to open my blocked artery, the police were conducting a more thorough investigation of my house and David's story. What they found would shock me even more than what I'd already endured. During my recovery in the hospital, the full scope of David's plan became clear. The police had obtained a search warrant for my house and David's belongings, and what they discovered painted a picture of premeditated, attempted murder. In David's room, investigators found his laptop with a disturbing browser history. He had researched heart attack symptoms extensively, looking up how long it takes for someone to die from a heart attack without medical intervention. He had also searched for information about life insurance payouts and how quickly claims could be processed. Most damning was a series of text messages between David and his creditors. He owed $50,000 to a loan shark who had given him until the end of March to pay up or face serious consequences. In one message thread, David had written, "I'll have the money soon. My mother is old and has a heart condition. Nature might take care of this problem for me." The police also discovered that David had been slowly increasing the stress in my life, deliberately creating situations that would elevate my blood pressure. He had been putting small amounts of caffeine powder in my food, hoping to trigger heart palpitations. The bitter taste in my coffee that last morning hadn't been my imagination. During his interrogation, David initially tried to maintain his innocence, but when confronted with the evidence, he eventually confessed. He admitted that he had planned to let me die of what would appear to be a natural heart attack, then use my life insurance money to pay his debts and start over. "She's old anyway," he said to the detective, showing no remorse. "She was going to die soon anyway. I just needed the money now." The detective later told me that in all his years of law enforcement, he had rarely encountered such cold calculation from a child toward a parent. David had meticulously planned my murder, banking on the fact that no one would suspect a son of letting his mother die. But he hadn't counted on Martha Williams. Martha visited me every day during my hospital stay. She brought flowers from her garden, homemade soup, and most importantly, her friendship. "I knew something wasn't right," she told me. "A mother doesn't cry for help at her window unless something terrible is happening." The hardest part of my recovery wasn't the physical healing from the heart attack. It was coming to terms with the fact that my own son, the child I had carried, raised and loved unconditionally, had been willing to watch me die for money. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical pain. David was charged with attempted murder, false imprisonment, and elder abuse. During the trial, which took place 4 months later, I had to testify about what he had done. Sitting in that courtroom looking at my son in his orange jumpsuit was one of the most difficult things I've ever done. The prosecutor presented all the evidence, the research on his computer, the text messages, the physical evidence of the locked door and stolen phones, and Martha's eyewitness testimony. David's defense attorney tried to argue that it was all a misunderstanding, that David had panicked and made poor decisions, but the evidence was overwhelming. When the judge asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement, I stood up and looked directly at David. "You weren't just willing to let me die," I told him. "You planned it. You calculated it. You took away my phone and locked me in that room knowing I was having a heart attack. I will never understand how the child I raised could become someone capable of such cruelty." David showed no emotion during my statement. He didn't apologize or show any sign of remorse. Even facing 15 years in prison, he seemed only angry that his plan had failed. The judge sentenced David to 15 years for attempted murder and additional time for the other charges. As the bailiff led him away, he didn't even look back at me. In that moment, I realized that the son I had loved was gone and had been replaced by someone I didn't recognize. The months following the trial were the hardest of my life. I had survived a heart attack and my son's attempt to murder me, but I had to learn how to live with the emotional trauma of what had happened. I sold my house because I couldn't bear to live in the place where David had tried to kill me, and I moved to a small apartment 3 blocks away from Martha. Martha became my lifeline during this period. She helped me pack up my belongings, and when we found David's childhood photos and school projects in his room, she held me while I cried. She never once said, "I told you so," even though she had sensed something was wrong with David from the beginning. Evil can hide behind any face, Martha told me one day as we sat in my new living room. Even faces we love. But good people can hide in plain sight too, and sometimes they're closer than we think. I struggled with trust for a long time. If my own son could betray me so completely, how could I ever trust anyone again? I went to counseling, which helped. But it was Martha's consistent presence and kindness that truly began to heal my heart. 6 months after the trial, I started volunteering at the hospital where I had been treated. I worked with elderly patients who, like me, had experienced medical emergencies. Many of them had stories of family members who had disappointed or abandoned them, and I found comfort in knowing I wasn't alone. One day, while visiting a patient who had no family, I realized that Martha had become more than just a friend to me. She had become the family I chose, the sister I never had. Blood didn't make David loyal to me, but love and kindness had made Martha one of the most important people in my world. Martha and I developed a routine. We have coffee together every morning, tend our gardens side by side, and watch out for each other in ways that real family should. She saved my life that day, but more than that, she taught me that there are still good people in this world who will help a neighbor in need. I still have days when the betrayal hurts, when I think about the little boy who used to bring me dandelions and tell me he loved me. But I've learned that people can change sometimes in ways that break our hearts. What I've also learned is that we can choose to surround ourselves with people who truly care about us, people who prove their love through actions, not just words. I don't hate David, though many people tell me I should. Hatred would only poison my own heart, and I refuse to let his choices steal any more of my peace. Instead, I choose to focus on the love and kindness that Martha showed me, and I try to pass that same compassion on to others. My life is different now, smaller in some ways but richer in others. I have a friend who watches out for me from her kitchen window, not out of nosiness, but out of love. I have a purpose in helping other elderly people who face medical emergencies without family support, and I have the knowledge that I am stronger than I ever knew possible. The most important lesson I learned from this experience is that family isn't always defined by blood. Sometimes the people who love us most are the ones who choose to be in our lives, who show up when we need them, and who prove their loyalty through their actions. Martha saved my life that day. But more than that, she taught me that there are still good people in this world watching out for each other. I learned that blood doesn't always mean loyalty, and sometimes the family we choose loves us more than the family we're born into. Martha saved my life that day, but more than that, she taught me that there are still good people in this world watching out for each other. Have you ever had to learn to trust again after someone close to you betrayed you? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like and subscribe for more real-life stories. Share this video with someone who might need to hear that there are still good people in the world. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember to always trust your instincts and never ignore those red flags, even when they come from the people closest to you. May you find the kind of friendship and loyalty that Martha showed me. And may you always have someone watching out for you when you need it most.